In the winter of 1922, in the small Alabama town of Briar Hollow, Reverend Josiah Carter walked the red clay road toward Mount Olive Church with a Bible under his arm and a storm gathering above him. The year had already taken too much from the town: failed crops, vanished wages, and nights haunted by the rattle of hooves and masked riders, but Josiah carried himself with a solemn calm, as if the weight of the world belonged in his hands by divine appointment. The dawn air smelled of pine and distant smoke, and each breath he drew felt like a quiet act of defiance in a place where a black man's voice was expected to stay small. Yet Josiah was known for speaking in a tone that stirred rooms, a tone that made people believe freedom might listen if they called loudly enough. And although the Klan ruled Briar Hollow with threats disguised as warnings, he had chosen to preach the truth anyway, softly at first, then boldly, until silence itself began to tremble. Outside the church, frost clung to the wooden steps, turning them white as bone, and the wind whistled through the cracked shutters like a restless spirit. Josiah paused there, sensing the unease woven into the morning light. He had heard that the Klan had met again the night before, that his name had been spoken in a room lit only by lanterns and hatred. Still, he unlocked the door with steady hands, the creak echoing through the empty sanctuary. The pews waited in the dimness, like patient witnesses, the scent of old hymns lingering in the air. He lit a single oil lamp, its glow stretching across the pulpit where so many had gathered seeking strength. Today he felt the weight of their hope pressing against him, men exhausted from the fields, women carrying grief like a second skin, children growing up with fear stitched into their nights. Every soul looked to him, and every word he uttered carried the risk of awakening fury beyond measure. But Josiah believed that truth, unspoken, took root in the earth like a seed that no fire could scorch. That belief had cost him friendships, safety, and sleep, yet it never loosened its grip. He remembered the day he buried Samuel Davis, a quiet man beaten for refusing to kneel to masked cowards, and how the town's silence afterward felt like a second murder. From that day on, Josiah vowed that Briar Hollow would hear what the world had tried to bury. He vowed to preach names the Klan wanted forgotten, to speak courage into those who had been taught fear since birth, to lift prayers that rose higher than hatred dared to climb. And as he stood beneath the flickering lamplight, he knew the time was coming when his voice would cost him everything. Yet he also knew that some men were born to carry torches into darkness, not to destroy, but to reveal the faces hiding there. The cold morning deepened as Reverend Josiah stepped behind the pulpit, laying his Bible gently upon the worn wooden surface. Its edges softened by years of trembling hands, turning pages in search of hope. The sanctuary was empty now, but he preached into it anyway, letting his words settle into the cracks of the floorboards as he rehearsed the sermon he would soon give. His voice, low and deliberate, filled the space with a kind of sacred gravity. He spoke of truth as a lantern carried through storms, of justice as a river waiting to break its banks, of fear as a brittle mask that shatters under the weight, of courage. Each syllable felt like a stone placed carefully upon an altar built from memory and pain. Outside, the rising wind brushed against the stained glass windows, scattering slivers of pale light across his face, and he wondered if the world beyond those walls was already shifting, preparing to test the strength of every word he dared to speak. As he lifted his gaze, the morning shadows turned to silhouettes of the congregation he knew so well. Faces worn by labor, hardened by a quiet suffering, yet brightened by a hope too stubborn to die. He could almost see Sister Maybelle in her usual pew, hands clasped tight, whispering prayers for her 2 sons working the cotton fields under a system designed to keep them bent low. He imagined Deacon Turner sitting with his shoulders tight, haunted by the cruelty he had witnessed and the dignity he still fought to keep. Josiah felt them all gathering in the room like a silent army, not with weapons, but with memory, faith, and the fierce desire to be seen. His voice grew stronger, echoing through the rafters with a rhythm that felt older than the church itself. Each word pressed against the air like a declaration, a reminder that even in the heart of Alabama, even under the shadow of white hoods, the spirit of a people could rise like a tide no night rider could drown. But beneath his rising conviction, a tremor of unease threaded through his spine, quiet but insistent, like the distant roll of thunder before a storm breaks. He remembered the message slipped under his door the night before, a scrap of paper bearing 5 words written in jagged charcoal. "Your silence is overdue, Reverend." The handwriting was clumsy, the threat unmistakable. He had held it over the lamp flame until it curled into ash, yet its echo remained, lingering now in the stillness of the church. Still, as he placed his hand upon the cool surface of the pulpit, he felt something steadier take hold inside him, a resolve shaped by generations who had survived far worse. If the clan wanted silence, they had chosen the wrong man to demand it from. Josiah inhaled deeply, letting the cold air sharpen his clarity. When he finally whispered the words, "Lord, guide my mouth," the sanctuary seemed to hold its breath, as if heaven itself leaned closer to listen. By the time the sun lifted above the pines, the churchyard was stirring with life, footsteps crunching over frost as families arrived. Wrapped in coats patched more with memory than cloth, their breath rose in pale clouds, drifting upward like fragile prayers, and Josiah watched them gather with a tenderness that tightened his chest. He saw fathers bowing their heads before crossing the threshold, mothers guiding little ones whose eyes carried more questions than any child should bear. The air hummed with quiet anticipation, but beneath it, Josiah felt something heavier, an unspoken fear shared by every soul who stepped. Inside, they had all heard whispers of the clan's meeting, of a vote taken in a smoke-filled barn, of a name spoken too loudly, his. Yet the people came anyway. They filled the pews with a courage stitched from necessity, sitting shoulder to shoulder as if unity itself were a shield against the danger creeping closer with each passing day. As the sanctuary warmed with bodies and murmured greetings, Josiah moved among them, touching shoulders, offering a soft word or a nod that held more strength than any sermon. He paused beside old Henry Jacobs, whose limp testified to a lifetime of hard years, and beside young Clara Davis, whose father's grave had barely settled before winter winds claimed the fields. These were the lives he had promised to protect with truth, the same truth that now put them all at risk. He felt their eyes lingering on him with a trust that pressed deep into his spirit, heavier than any burden he had carried before. When the church bell sounded, 3 slow tolls that echoed across the valley, Josiah stepped toward the pulpit, watching the congregation fall silent, their faces turned toward him like lanterns seeking flame. The moment held steady, trembling with expectation, as though the world outside had paused to listen at the church door. He opened his Bible with reverence, its pages worn thin from nights spent wrestling with doubt and dawns spent gathering strength. The soft rustle carried through the room like the stirring of wings. When Josiah began to speak, his voice was steady, but its edges held fire. He talked of a courage that did not roar but endured, of a God who walked with those who refused to bow, of a people whose worth no hooded rider could erase. His words rose slowly at first, then gathered momentum, sweeping through the sanctuary like a warm wind breaking through winter's chill. Faces lifted, shoulders straightened, tears glimmered in eyes that had forgotten how to hope. In that moment, Josiah felt the power of their unity pulsing through the room, a force as ancient as liberation itself. And though he knew the clan listened from the shadows beyond the town, he did not temper his voice. Truth, once set ablaze, had no duty to whisper. When the final note of the hymn faded, a hush settled over the sanctuary, so complete it seemed to reshape the very air, turning it thick with the weight of things unspoken. Josiah closed the Bible slowly, feeling the hard truth of what came next, pressing against his ribs like a warning. Today's sermon had carried farther than the walls of Mount Olive. He could almost sense the echo of it slipping through the cracks in the wood, traveling across fields and dirt roads to ears that waited for any reason to strike. Yet he also felt the congregation leaning toward him as if drawn by instinct, their breaths shallow, their spirits poised on the fragile edge between fear and awakening. He saw the trembling hands of women who had buried brothers, the clenched jaws of men who had learned to survive by swallowing their anger, the wide eyes of children who listened as though every word shaped the world they would inherit. And in that sea of faces, he understood that his voice was no longer his own. It belonged to all who had been told to suffer quietly. Josiah stepped down from the pulpit, the floorboards groaning softly under his weight, and walked to the center aisle where the morning light cut a pale path through the dust-filled air. He lifted his chin and addressed them not as a preacher speaking to a flock, but as a man standing among equals, bound to them by scars older than any of their years. He spoke of Samuel Davis again, how the silence that followed his death had suffocated the town more than grief ever could. He told them that the true danger was not the clan's ropes or torches, but the quiet surrender that settled into a community when fear became its ruler. Murmurs rippled through the pews as his words struck familiar wounds, and Josiah saw something shift in the congregation, small at first, like the trembling of a leaf before a storm's arrival. It was the beginning of refusal, the first breath of a people deciding they would no longer carry shame for the violence committed against them. Even the children seemed stiller, their eyes tracing his movements with a solemn understanding far beyond their tender years. As Josiah's voice deepened, a soft rumble of wind pressed against the church walls, rattling the cracked panes in their frames, as if urging him forward. He knew the clan had tried to silence him because they understood what he had long believed. That truth, once spoken aloud, becomes a living thing. It stirs rooms, it awakens courage, it awakens memory, it awakens the kind of unity that terrifies men who rely on shadows to keep their power. So he declared, with a clarity that left no corner untouched, that their lives were not debts to be paid in obedience, but sacred inheritances carved from suffering and survival. The congregation leaned in, anchored by his conviction, and for a moment the church felt larger than Briar Hollow, larger than Alabama, a vessel carrying the breath of every ancestor who had endured chains, whips, and the long night of silence. When he finally said, "We will not bow," the words seemed to burn into the very grain of the wood. And somewhere deep within him, Josiah felt the shift, something decisive, irreversible, as if the sermon had crossed a boundary none of them could step back from now. When the service ended, the congregation lingered, as if reluctant to step back into a world that waited with sharpened breath just beyond the church doors. The wooden floor creaked beneath hesitant footsteps, and whispers scattered like dry leaves in a restless wind. Women gathered their children close. Men exchanged heavy glances marked by both dread and determination, and Josiah felt the tension radiating from them in silent waves. He walked slowly down the aisle, offering a steady hand, a brief nod, a blessing spoken softly enough not to tremble the air. But beneath every gesture lived the same unspoken truth. They all knew that what had been said within those walls carried a price, and that the first bill would be delivered to his door. Outside, the sky had darkened strangely for morning, clouds bunching together like a great curtain, preparing to fall. The wind hummed through the pines with an edge that felt watchful, almost listening, and Josiah sensed that something in the day had turned, shifting the ground beneath their feet. As people stepped onto the church steps, the sound of hooves echoed from the ridge, slow, measured, deliberate. Conversations stopped mid-breath. Children froze like small birds, sensing the presence of a hawk. Josiah stepped out after them, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the distant curve of the dirt road. A lone rider approached, dressed in a dark coat with the brim of his hat pulled low, his face shadowed but posture unmistakably rigid. He rode a powerful bay horse, its breath steaming in the cold air, and the deep thud of its hooves beat a stern rhythm across the valley. The congregation drew back instinctively, forming a protective half-circle around the reverend. The rider halted at the foot of the steps, lifted his chin just enough to reveal the sharp line of his jaw, and spoke in a voice that carried without being loud. "Reverend Carter," he said, "the men in town say your sermon traveled farther than it should have." The words were neither threat nor courtesy. They were a warning dressed in the thin cloth of civility. Josiah stepped forward alone, feeling the weight of the congregation settle behind him like a wall of breath held tight. The horse snorted, stamping at the frost-covered ground as though impatient with the stillness. The riders, eyes grey and cold as riverstone, looked the reverend over with a scrutiny meant to intimidate, but Josiah met that gaze with a steadiness carved from years of standing before storms. "The truth goes where it's needed," he replied, his voice calm, almost gentle. A flicker passed across the rider's face, annoyance, perhaps surprise, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Careful how you stir this town, Reverend," the man said. "Some folks don't take kindly to being woken up." He tugged on the reins, turning the horse sharply before adding, "And some don't forget who shook them awake." The rider galloped off without waiting for an answer, leaving behind a trail of dust, and a silence so taut it seemed to vibrate. Josiah stood motionless for a long moment, feeling the congregation's fear gather like a shadow at his back. But inside him, something far stronger rose to meet it. The congregation slowly dispersed after the rider vanished over the ridge, but their footsteps carried the heaviness of people leaving a sanctuary only to enter another kind of battlefield. Josiah remained on the steps long after the last hymn book had been tucked beneath an arm, watching the clouds gather in dark folds above the pines. The wind shifted, colder now, carrying the distant scent of smoke, faint but sharp enough to make his pulse quicken. He breathed in deeply, searching the horizon for movement, for the glint of lanterns or the pale shimmer of cotton hoods. Nothing yet. But he felt the day tightening around him like a rope being drawn one knot at a time. Inside the church, the final echoes of the morning service clung to the wooden beams, fragments of courage holding fast in the quiet. Josiah touched the doorframe gently, the wood rough beneath his fingertips, and whispered a prayer not for safety, but for strength. He knew danger was no longer a question of if, but when, and the hours ahead felt like stepping stones stretched across a widening river. Back in his study, the small room tucked behind the altar, Josiah sat at his narrow desk and allowed the silence to settle over him like a familiar cloak. A single oil lamp flickered beside a stack of letters, notes from families pleading for protection, for guidance, for help he scarcely felt equipped to give. He unfolded one written in a shaky hand, the words trembling on the page. "They came to our door last night." He closed it before reading the rest, pressing his thumb against the fold, as though holding back the weight of another family's terror. His eyes drifted to the window, where thin branches brushed the glass like restless fingers. Every whisper of wind felt like footsteps approaching. Every creak of old wood sounded like a warning. Yet there, in that fragile quiet, he felt an unusual calm take root. Fear was a familiar companion, but purpose burned brighter. He realized with a clarity that startled him that the clan's threats no longer frightened him as much as the idea of remaining silent. Silence was the soil in which their power grew. He rose and walked toward the far corner of the study, where a small chest rested beneath a threadbare quilt. Inside lay the relics of years gone, a pair of worn spectacles that belonged to his father, a hymn book from his mother's childhood, and a faded ribbon from the march where he first learned the cost of speaking truth aloud. Beneath those items lay a folded coat, heavy, dark, and thick enough to withstand winter nights on roads no man should walk alone. He lifted it gently, feeling the weight settle across his arms like an old duty he had tried once to lay down. He slipped it on, its familiar heaviness grounding him. The room dimmed as the lamp sputtered, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like silent witnesses. Josiah stood in that half-light, shoulders squared, breath steady. He no longer felt like a man waiting for danger to arrive. He felt like a man preparing to meet it, and outside, as if answering his unspoken resolve, the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the valley. By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened into a heavy bruise, the air thick with the weight of a storm that refused to break. Josiah stepped outside the church, the wind tugging at his coat as though urging him toward the path that led into town. Briar Hollow lay quiet in the dim light, its narrow road lined with sagging porches and shuttered windows that seemed to watch him with wary eyes. Word of the morning's sermon had spread quickly. He could feel it in the way doors opened just a crack as he passed, in the murmur of voices that fell silent when they realized he was near. Yet beneath the tension lay something else, something fragile but alive. A quiet expectation, as if the people sensed that the Reverend's steps were guiding them toward a truth long overdue. The wind carried the faint smell of wood smoke and damp earth, and each gust swept dry leaves across the road like small messengers whispering warnings he already understood. He paused at the general store, its wooden sign creaking overhead as Uncle Horace stepped onto the porch, wiping flour from his hands. Horace's lined face was clouded with concern, his eyes scanning the empty road behind Josiah before settling on him with a grim certainty. "They're watching you," he murmured, voice low. "Men rode through last night wearing plain clothes, but it don't fool nobody." Josiah felt the words sink into him like cold water, but his expression remained steady. Horace leaned closer, whispering, "I heard your name at the mill. They say you're stirring fires that'll burn the rest of us." The old man's voice trembled, not with anger, but with fear for a world that had never shown mercy to those who dared to speak. Josiah placed a hand on his shoulder, firm yet gentle, and replied, "Fires only burn what's dry. The truth grows roots too deep to scorch." The wind shifted then, sending a shiver through the trees, as though the land itself acknowledged the risk of such boldness. As Josiah continued down the road, a sudden movement caught his eye. A young boy, no older than 10, standing beside the well, with his cap clutched in both hands. His face was pale, eyes wide with a fear he struggled to contain. When Josiah drew near, the boy whispered, "Reverend, they're coming tonight." The words quivered on, his tongue barely louder than the rustle of leaves. "My uncle heard 'em planning, said they aim to make you stop preaching for good." Josiah crouched to meet the boy's gaze, the storm-dark sky reflected in the child's trembling eyes. "Thank you for telling me," he said softly. "Courage ain't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper that chooses truth." The boy nodded, shoulders shaking beneath the weight of a secret no child should carry. Josiah watched him run back toward home, a small figure swallowed by the gathering dusk. Then he rose slowly, feeling the day narrow into a single, undeniable path. Night was approaching, and with it, the clan. As dusk bled slowly into night, Josiah returned to the church. its silhouette rising against a sky swollen with storm clouds that pulsed with distant lightning. The air grew thick and metallic, humming with the uneasy charge that settles just before thunder cracks the world awake. Inside, the sanctuary lay in dim quiet, the last traces of daylight slipping through the stained glass windows in thin, ghostly bands. Josiah moved through the pews with deliberate calm, placing a lamp at the pulpit, checking the latch on the back door, and pausing once to rest his hand against the altar. The wood felt cool beneath his palm, as if the church itself breathed in slow, steady rhythms. Outside, the wind moaned against the eaves like a warning spirit pacing the shadows. He knew the hours ahead would stretch long and dangerous, but he felt none of the trembling fear that had haunted him in younger years. Instead, he felt anchored, rooted in a purpose older than the hatred that stalked the roads of Briar Hollow. He stepped into the narrow hallway behind the sanctuary, where the single window framed the darkening world outside. The road was nearly invisible now, swallowed by the thickening gloom, yet Josiah sensed movement beyond the tree line, a faint shift in the branches, the ripple of something. Watching from afar, he lit the small lamp on his desk, its glow soft and amber, casting elongated shadows across the floorboards. From a drawer, he withdrew a folded letter written earlier that day, addressed to no one by name, but meant for all who might find it, should the night claim him. Its words were simple, but heavy with truth. That silence had never saved a single soul, and that his voice belonged to a story bigger than his own life. He placed the letter upon the desk, waited, by a smooth river stone he had carried since childhood. The wind rattled the shutters then, a sharp, warning tremor that vibrated through the walls. Josiah exhaled slowly, the breath steady, almost serene, as if preparing himself for the final verse of a hymn. When he stepped outside onto the porch, the night had thickened into something nearly tangible. A dark veil stretched across the fields. The moon hid behind clouds, offering no silver trail to break the darkness. Josiah stood beneath the eaves, coat pulled tight, listening to the vast, trembling stillness. In the distance, an owl called once, low and mournful, then silence reclaimed the valley. He looked toward the ridge where the lone rider had appeared that morning, imagining the men gathering now in barns and back rooms, their whispers thick with venom, their plans threaded with cruelty. He felt neither panic nor regret, only a solemn clarity that settled deep in his bones. "Lord," he murmured, his voice swallowed by the wind, "walk with me through this shadow." A soft rumble of thunder answered in the distance, rolling across the fields like a celestial drumbeat. Josiah stepped back inside, closing the door with gentle finality. The night had begun to move, and somewhere far beyond the trees, the clan was mounting. Night tightened its grip on Briar Hollow until the world seemed carved from shadow, the air pulsing with a tension so thick it felt like breath held by the land itself. Josiah stood in the center of the sanctuary, the single oil lamp casting a trembling halo of gold around him, its flame bending with every sigh of wind that seeped through the old boards. The pews, empty and solemn, stretched before him like rows of silent witnesses waiting for a verdict. He could feel the church's wooden bones creak softly beneath the strain of the gathering storm, as though the structure understood the danger pressing toward it. Outside, the first sharp patter of rain tapped against the roof, uneven, hesitant, almost cautious. Then came another sound, faint but unmistakable, the distant rhythm of hooves, slow and purposeful, beating against the soaked earth with the deliberation of men who believed the night belonged to them. Josiah stepped toward the window, careful not to disturb the lamp's fragile flame. The glass was cold beneath his fingertips, fogged by the breath of the storm, but beyond its blurred surface he saw small bursts of light flickering between the trees, lanterns moving in steady procession. He counted 4, then 5, then more, their glow shuddering like embers carried by unseen hands. The riders' figures, dark and shapeless beneath slicker coats, emerged only in fragments, glimpses of shoulders hunched forward, hints of pale cloth tucked beneath their collars, the faint gleam of metal. The clan had come disguised by the storm, not in hoods, but in anonymity, letting the darkness cloak their faces. A deep calm settled over Josiah then, not the numbness of resignation, but the clarity of a man who understood that the hour he had lived toward had finally arrived. He placed his palm flat against the windowpane, feeling the faint vibration of hooves approach, and whispered a prayer without moving his lips. The rain quickened, drumming against the roof in relentless rhythm, yet beneath it he heard the riders halt outside the church. Boots striking the muddy ground, low murmurs drifting through, the night like the hiss of serpents. The sanctuary seemed to inhale, its walls growing still and taut with expectation. Josiah returned to the pulpit, the lamp's glow stretching his shadow long across the floorboards, and opened his Bible to the passage he had marked hours earlier. Thunder cracked, shaking the windows in their brittle frames, and in that roar he felt a surge of strength rise within him, steady, immovable, forged from faith that refused to bend. Then came the first heavy knock at the door, not frantic but deliberate, the kind meant to remind a man that escape no longer existed. The lamp flickered. The air thickened. Josiah lifted his chin, laid a steady hand upon the pulpit, and prepared to meet the night with every truth he had ever spoken. The second knock came harder, 3 slow thuds that rattled the hinges and sent a ripple of vibration through the wooden floorboards beneath Josiah's feet. The rain outside had strengthened into a relentless curtain, its roar fusing with the storm's growl, until the night itself felt like a living creature pressing against the church walls. Josiah stepped down from the pulpit, each footfall measured, steady, deliberate. The lamp's wavering light stretched his shadow tall across the aisle, giving him the silhouette of a man both rooted in earth and rising toward something unseen. As he neared the doorway, he could hear the muffled exchange of voices on the other side, low, sharp, dripping, with the cruel certainty of men convinced they owned the night. The doorknob trembled as someone tried it, finding it locked. Then a voice rose above the storm, flat and cold. "Reverend Carter, open up. We aim to speak to you." The words held no pretense of conversation. They carried the chill of a sentence already prepared. Josiah did not reach for the door. Instead, he placed his hand on the wall beside it, feeling the thrum of rain and distant thunder vibrating through the old wood. He could sense the riders shifting outside, boots grinding into the mud as lanterns hissed in the downpour. The storm masked their features, but he could imagine them. Faces set in shadows, jaws clenched, fingers twitching near rifles hidden beneath coats. The air inside the sanctuary thickened with a sacred stillness, the kind that precedes a reckoning long overdue. Josiah inhaled deeply, grounding himself in the memory of every soul who had been silenced by fear. Every name buried beneath injustice, every nightwalker who had left families trembling in locked cabins praying for dawn. When he finally spoke, his voice did not tremble. "If you have words," he said, his tone calm as the storm was wild, "speak them through the door. What I stand for cannot be moved." Silence followed, brief but tense enough to bend the air. Then came the answer, a laugh smothered into something mean. "We ain't here for your stand-in," the voice sneered. "We're here to end your talking." A fist slammed against the door, a blow so forceful the lamp flickered, casting warped shadows across the sanctuary like warning spirits. Outside, the sound of boots shifted as more men gathered near the steps, their presence heavy, suffocating, unmistakable. Josiah felt the ground beneath him quiver beneath the dual weight of thunder and threat, but his resolve only deepened, settling into his bones like a final vow. He stepped back from the door and raised his chin, allowing the church's vast silence to wrap around him like a mantle of ancient courage. The storm roared, the lanterns hissed, the night pressed forward as though preparing to swallow him whole. And still, Josiah whispered into the dark, "Truth has outlived men stronger than you." The storm struck with sudden ferocity, lightning cleaving the sky in jagged streaks that illuminated the stained-glass windows in violent, fleeting bursts. Each flash revealed the silhouettes of the men. Outside, brief, ghost-like shapes lunging through the downpour, their forms distorted by rain and shadow. The door shuddered under another blow, this one delivered with something heavier than a fist. Josiah stood at the center of the sanctuary, the lamp's weak glow clinging to him like a halo, refusing to be extinguished. The air inside was thick with heat from the storm, its pressure pressing down upon him as if the heavens themselves were leaning close to witness the moment. His heartbeat matched the thunder's rhythm, not in fear, but in a solemn sense of inevitability. He understood now that the night was not merely an assault, it was a summons, calling him to stand exactly where every generation before him had once stood, on the razor's edge between silence and sacrifice. The next sound was unmistakable, the scrape of metal across wood, the low grunt of men forcing something against the hinges. Josiah could almost picture them bracing their shoulders, muddy, boots slipping in the rain as they worked to break the barrier between hatred and sanctuary. A crack splintered across the upper panel of the door, thin as a lightning vein. Wind surged through it in a sharp breath, scattering hymnal pages from the front pew and sending them fluttering through the air like pale wings. Josiah watched them drift, one page catching on the edge of the pulpit, illuminated by the trembling lamp. It was a verse he had read earlier that week, one promising deliverance not from struggle, but through it. He stepped forward and laid a steady hand upon the pulpit, drawing strength from the grain worn smooth by decades of prayer. "This house," he murmured to himself, "was built on the faith of the broken, not the fear of the powerful." A violent crash shook the sanctuary as the lower hinge ripped halfway from its frame, wood splintering under the weight of the assault. Rain poured through the widening gap, pooling on the church floor, each drop pinging like a ticking clock, counting down the final moments before the door gave way. Josiah lifted the lamp carefully and placed it on the altar, its flame small but determined, refusing to submit to the draught that clawed at it. He turned toward the doorway, his posture straightening as lightning lit his figure with stark, otherworldly clarity. The men outside were shouting now, their voices jagged with impatience and rage, the storm swallowing their words before they reached full cruelty. Josiah inhaled deeply, filling his chest with the electric air of the storm, and whispered a final prayer, not for rescue, but for endurance. Then, as thunder boomed overhead, the Reverend stepped toward the cracking door, not to flee, not to plead, but to face what waited on the other side. The door finally gave way with a tortured crack, swinging inward as rain exploded into the sanctuary in a chaotic spray. The storm wind surged through the church like a living thing, extinguishing the lamp and plunging the room into darkness broken only by the violent pulse of lightning striking beyond the windows. Josiah did not retreat. He stood in the widening path of the storm, his silhouette framed by the jagged glow, his coat billowing behind him like a banner of defiance caught in turbulent wind. The men outside hesitated briefly at the threshold, their forms distorted by rain and shadow, their outlines wavering like uncertain phantoms. They had expected terror. They had expected pleading, but the sight of the Reverend standing tall in the storm's fury seemed to unnerve them in a way no weapon could have. The church groaned beneath the assault, its timbers trembling as though bracing for the weight of history pressing hard upon its worn foundation. A lantern appeared among the cluster of riders, its flame flickering beneath the shelter of a coat, revealing the pale jawline of the man who stepped forward. His wet slicker clung to him like a second skin, outlining the harsh rigidity of someone who believed cruelty was a duty. Lightning illuminated his eyes, cold, narrow, sharpened by a conviction built on dominance. He tilted his chin toward Josiah with a sneer carved from arrogance. "You had your chance to quiet yourself," he said, raising his voice just enough to cut through the roar of the storm. "Now we aim to finish what should have been done weeks ago." His words slithered through the air, heavy and poisonous. The other men shifted behind him, hands tightening around clubs and rifles, hidden beneath coats, their breaths hard and visible through the rain. Josiah's expression did not waver. Instead, he stepped forward into the half-light, his face calm, his eyes burning with a clarity that made even the thunder pause in its rolling cadence. "You came here for silence," Josiah replied, his voice rising with a quiet power that split the storm's roar like a blade through cloth. "But you walk with men who fear the sound of their own truth." Lightning flared, illuminating the stunned expressions of the riders, their confidence faltering for a heartbeat. Josiah continued, his tone neither pleading nor angry, but resolute, shaped by generations who had fought to keep their voices alive. "You believe a man can be stopped by threats, by shadows, by fear you forged in your own hearts. But truth outlives every hand that tries to crush it." Thunder erupted, shaking the windows in their frames as if the heavens themselves answered him. Rain hammered the steps, the wind pressing against the men with force, and for the first time that night, Josiah saw uncertainty flicker in their posture. The sanctuary behind him breathed like a living witness, its darkness filled not with dread, but with the echo of every word he had ever spoken. He stood unbroken, a single figure holding ground against the storm and the men who carried it in their wake. The wind surged again, driving sheets of rain across the threshold and forcing the men to brace themselves as the storm snarled through the church entrance. For a moment the world seemed suspended, lightning illuminating the sanctuary in stark white flashes, thunder shaking dust from the rafters, and Josiah standing unmoved in the center of it all. The lead rider stepped forward, anger flaring across his features, but the weather fought him with every step. His lantern sputtered wildly, shrinking the circle of light that had once cloaked their confidence. Behind him, the others shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, their resolve fraying beneath the weight of a night that refused to bend to their purpose. The storm was no longer simply weather. It was a force that revealed them, stripped of their masks, their shadows, their borrowed power. And in that revelation, Josiah sensed their fear growing, the kind that surfaces only when men realize the darkness they trusted has turned its back on them. The lead rider lifted his arm as if to signal the others, but a violent crack of thunder split the air directly overhead, so loud and sudden it silenced every voice. Lightning followed, bright as molten steel, striking the ground near the church with a force that shook the earth. The horses reared, screaming in terror, their hooves thrashing mud into the air. Lanterns tumbled from frantic hands, their flames snuffed by the rain before they even hit the ground. Chaos rippled through the riders as they struggled to control their panicked mounts. One man shouted a command lost in the tempest, another cursed as he slipped in the mud, and a third was thrown from his horse entirely, landing hard on the drenched earth. The storm had turned against them with a ferocity no threat could tame, and in the heart of that turmoil, Josiah took a single step forward, shoulders squared, coat whipping in the gale, a figure carved from resolve and holy defiance. The riders saw him then, not as a man they could silence, but as a truth they could not outrun. The lead rider regained his seat, soaked and shaken. and stared at Josiah with something that no longer resembled dominance. It was bewilderment, an unspoken recognition that their power had faltered in the presence of a man who refused to bow. He yanked on his reins, the horse snorting as if desperate to flee, and finally barked, "Fall back!" The words tore through the storm with more desperation than authority. One by one, the riders retreated, swallowed by darkness and rain, their lanterns gone, their confidence shattered. Josiah watched them disappear into the night, not with triumph, but with solemn understanding. The storm slowly softened, the thunder rolling farther and farther away, until only the steady patter of rain remained. He closed the broken door, sealing the sanctuary once more, and leaned his forehead against the wood. In the quiet that followed, he whispered a prayer of gratitude, not because danger had passed, but because he had stood his ground when silence would have been safer. The storm had not saved him. It had revealed him.